topics and opinions expressed in the following show are solely those of the hosts and their guests and not those of W4CY Radio, its employees, or affiliates. We make no recommendations or endorsements for radio show programs, services, or products mentioned on air or on our web. No liability, explicit or implied, shall be extended to W4CY Radio or its employees or affiliates. Any questions or comments should be directed to those show hosts. Thank you for choosing W4CY Radio.
What's working on purpose anyway? Each week, we ponder the answer to this question. People ache for meaning and purpose at work, to contribute their talents passionately and know their lives really matter. They crave being part of an organization that inspires them and helps them grow into realizing their highest potential. Business can be such a force for good in the world, elevating humanity. In our program, we provide guidance and inspiration to help usher in this world we all want, working on purpose. Now, here's your host, Dr. Elise Cortez.
Welcome back to the Working on Purpose program, which has been brought to you with passion and pride since February of 2015. Thanks for tuning in again this week. Great to have you. I'm your host, Dr. Elise Cortez. If we've not met before and you don't know me, I'm a workforce advisor, organizational psychologist, management consultant, logotherapist, speaker, and author. My team and I at Gusto Now help companies to enliven and fortify their operations by building a dynamic, high-performance culture, inspirational leadership, and nurturing managers activated by meaning and purpose. You can learn more about us and how we can work together at gusto-now.com or my personal site, elisecortez.com. Getting into today's program, we have with us today two dynamic men from Deloitte, Geoff Tuff and Stephen Goldbach. Geoff Tuff is a principal at Deloitte and holds various positions across the firm's sustainability, innovation, and strategy practices. Those include leadership of the U.S. hydrogen practice and all sectors related to energy. Geoff's work centers on helping clients transform their businesses to grow and compete in non-traditional ways. Also with us is Stephen Goldbach, who leads Deloitte's sustainability business in the U.S., which serves the complex and novel challenges their clients face across issues such as climate adaptation and other challenges associated with creating a more sustainable future. Previously, he served as Deloitte's U.S. Chief Strategy Officer for 8 years. They have written 3 books together. Today, we're talking about their latest, Hone, How Purposeful Leaders Defy Drift. Gentlemen, welcome back to Working on Purpose.
Thanks. Great to be here.
Yeah, thanks for having us again.
You guys are crazy and amazing at the same time, right? Can we just start with that? Can we level set that you're both crazy and amazing? Can we agree on that?
Well, I thought you were going to call one of us crazy and one of us amazing, and then just leave it out there to figure out which one is which.
For you to choose. No. I'm giving you both of these labels here. So, as I was thinking about this and I was reading your book, let's just flash this for the people who haven't read it yet. It's just gorgeous. I was just thinking to myself, I know, what goes on at Deloitte. You guys are really, really busy humans. And so here you are, you've unplanned and accidentally written a trilogy of books here. So let's just start with how in the world first do you find time to do that? What's the inspiration? I know a little something about this, but our listeners and viewers don't. Craziness explained, please.
Well, I'll say it has been an interesting journey, and I'm sure Steve has his own version of the journey as well over the course of I guess it's 8, maybe even close to 9 years now that Steve and I have been writing books together. And we've learned a lot about each other over time. And one of the things we've learned is that we're actually very different writers in terms of how we approach it, the times that we try to take it on, the joy or lack of joy that we get from it at certain points in time. And so we each have our own style. I will say for myself, finding the time is hard, but when I find it, I can really concentrate a lot of effort and bang out a lot of content all at once. Which I'm not saying is the same for Steve necessarily, but the good news here is that the stuff we write about is entirely consistent with what we experience in our work lives. It's not like 2 different lives here that we're somehow trying to live. We're actually taking lessons that we take from our client work day in, day out, and then trying to generalize them in a way that helps others that may be struggling with some of the same issues.
Awesome. Anything to add, Steve?
Look, it's just, I think it takes... one of the things it's forced me to do is I love writing and I love engaging with people about the ideas even more. That's the thing that I kind of enjoy about this process. And the writing process for me is about getting the best and most concise version of what we're seeing onto a piece of paper. And that makes our ideas crisper and easier to understand when we work with clients. So I think that that's sort of the synergistic aspect of it to our work. And so I don't find it a burden. It's one of those things where you just have to make the time to write. And I find having a good outline makes the writing process a little easier. I'm not as natural a writer as Geoff. Geoff had the benefit of a upbringing in writing, and I've kind of new to this over time.
I forget which one of you had the idea first of just maybe doing an article. Then the other one said, no, I've got bigger aspirations. Let's do a book. Which way did it go?
That's a good memory.
That's just telling the story.
I
do read your books, guys.
Yeah. So I had been writing for some time. As Steve said, I have a history in writing. I actually, way back when I studied to be a creative writing, that was my major in college. And I had always dabbled with trying to get thoughts out down on paper in a variety of different formats, from plays to poetry to fiction to what have you. But I guess my serious business writing career really started about 15 or 20 years ago, when I started writing articles for the likes of Harvard Business Review and other magazines, which were thankfully well received and became reasonably well circulated. And Steve and I had worked together at the same firm for some time. Then we ran in the same circles, and it was after that firm actually joined up with Deloitte, and we both came to Deloitte. We were at a session together, and Steve said, "Hey, I've read some of your stuff." And actually, Steve had published some pieces as well. One, I was just telling him 2 days ago that one has stuck in my head ever since it came out, about the difference between hockey and football applied to business, which I'll leave that out to linger. And he said, "Hey, we should do some writing together at some point." And I made what I thought was a very gracious offer to come and be a guest blogger on the blog that I was writing for HuffPost at the time. And Steve had bigger aspirations than that, didn't you, Steve?
But my aspirations was not a book. So the aspiration was we could write something together in HBR or something like that. And then it was Geoff that said, well, actually, this book publisher, Wiley, has been chasing us for a follow-up to the 10 Types of Innovation. And that was the origin story for Detonate. And then it just flourished from there.
Well, let's talk about that briefly. So since you have now written the Accidental trilogy, you say unplanned, but I like the idea of calling it accidental. Let's just, if we can, sketch the ideas from each. You have Detonate first, and then Provoke, which we talked about in the last conversation we had together, and now, of course, Hone. Give us a little understanding of how maybe the ideas stitch together for those three.
Maybe I'll give us a head start, and Geoff can add. So I think Detonate, if we're giving the users sort of the behind the scenes story, Detonate was, we had an observation or several observations about the world, that there was just a bunch of things that businesses did in the name of best practices that, when you take a jaundiced eye, a skeptic's eye to them, made no sense. And we needed to change those supposed best practices. And then Provoke is really about how you shape the future to your advantage early by identifying trends that are a matter of when they'll come to fruition rather than a matter of if. We tend to wait as managers far too long. And then Hone is really about how do you, on a more ongoing basis, manage the system to your advantage. If I'm going back and saying, like, what's the common thread and how would I explain it today, not necessarily like when we say unplanned or accidental, I think that's because we didn't set out with this. I think part of this is a recognition that you don't usually know the future. You've got to manage companies more from a perspective of first principles, i.e. satisfying customer needs, changing human behavior is the most basic subatomic particle in business, really constantly looking to the future for what's coming next, and then trying to shape your surroundings toward that. But then being vigilant is really where we get to in Hone. Being vigilant about not just believing that you're good once you said it. You have to be carefully managing your environment, because it's constantly changing, whether it's competition or technology, and that's where we get to with home. But I'm sure Geoff would add to that, as I see him chomping at the bit to come in.
No, I didn't know it was that obvious after 8 years together, Steve. But I think that's a good summary. We could obviously go a lot deeper on each book, but I will say that we have taken a page from our own quote unquote teachings or writings over time. And one of the themes that we come back to time and again in all three books is, and this is an overstatement for effect, but things are always better if you pay really keen attention to the markets you serve and the quote unquote customers or users you serve. And I will say that we've found after each book that we did leave our readers wanting a little bit more, not necessarily of our writing, but of the kind of what comes next. So Detonate was about blowing up the playbooks. And after you've blown up the playbooks, and, we did suggest at that point some principles of how managers can work effectively or lead effectively in an age of uncertainty, but it wasn't really okay, so what's next? So Provoke then was the logical follow-up to that after you've blown up the playbooks, to say, how do you actually create the future in which you have advantage when you actually need to start rebuilding things? And Hone, again, was the logical follow-up to Provoke, because we create the future, but then how do you manage differently than you have in the past once you start to approach that future? And so even though it has been accidental, I am proud at how all three of the books hold together, and at this point actually do feel somewhat complete.
Mm-hmm. Delightful. Now, speaking of delightful, I really love it, since I do read a book every single week for this podcast, cover to cover, and I take the notes and everything else. That's my research. I get delighted when authors do something a little bit different and compelling. And so in your case, of course, you have helped us learn from 4 distinct artisans in your book about this idea of honing. And I think it's just delightful. So will you introduce us briefly to your 4 artisans that give us inspiration and direction in the book?
Yeah, why don't we do it in rough order of their appearance in the book, Steve? So why don't you lead us off with Flannery?
Yeah, I'll take Flannery, you take Anna, I'll take Sam, you take Our Lady Peace. So this is a good example, Elise, of where, we have to come up with creative ways to tell stories. Mm-hmm. We're in a business where we're not able to divulge any of the work we do with clients. And so part of it is we look for stories that would share the same benefit, that are, wonderful to share with the world. And Flannery's story has been sort of, we made it the centerpiece of chapter 1, because it was a conversation with her that led us to the title of Hone. And it basically is, she's a wonderful chef. She works in people's homes. She doesn't have a restaurant. And she comes over and she'll do special gigs and parties and things like that. And we had the benefit of knowing her for the last 15 years. And I noticed that she's just always, I thought she was sharpening her knives before every gig. And I said, like, Flannery, why do you do that every time? And she's like, I'm not sharpening them, Steve. She's got this crazy, way to talk. She's like, I'm not sharpening them, I'm honing them. There's a big difference. Honing doesn't take away any of the steel. Sharpening actually takes steel off the blade. You're actually thinning the blade. You're making it more brittle. And honing is realigning the steel that exists to make it cut the way it was originally intended to the last time it was sharpened. And she was saying, this is just keeping the knives sharp the way I want them to be, because a sharp knife is actually a safer knife inside the kitchen. But then the thing she said also was, honing is a maintenance and a meditation. And so it was also not just about maintaining the knives. It was also about reminding herself right before an event about, this is what I'm trying to do. It's like a way to focus ourselves. So we thought that was a great metaphor for keeping an organization sharp the last time you made major changes, to making sure it's doing what you're wanting it to do, but also reminding you to focus on the things that are super important: your customers, your employees, what's your elemental purpose in business, and how do you do that. So that's the lessons we took away from Flannery.
And then the second artisan we profiled, Anna van der Waal, is actually best known out in the world as probably one of the most, if not the most prolific and well-known marine photographers. So he's become famous shooting photos of sailboats and sail races and what have you. But he's got a really interesting life story about. And he was born in South Africa, grew up around boats, but really most of what he has learned over time and that he's been able to apply to his photography came from him tinkering in first a machine shop and then on boats. He's a world-class sailor himself. He's actually had a number of different documentaries made about him that ultimately come back to him rebuilding some old boats from scratch. And what fascinated us about Anna as we got into it was not just the way he constructed the pictures he makes, but what he did in his off time and the fact that he is ultimately the consummate tinkerer. And what we're trying to teach business executives is to be consummate tinkerers at your craft.
Love it, guys. Okay, and let's go ahead and get the last two, and then we'll go on break. Sam Pollard.
So Sam is a film editor and a documentary filmmaker himself. He is famous as an editor for editing a number of Spike Lee's films in the 1990s. He is an Oscar-nominated filmmaker. He's won a number of other awards. He's made a number of amazing documentaries as well, some together with Spike and some on his own. He is just what I found compelling about his evolution is he has, to some extent, softened his approach over the years. And now what he really just focuses on is making his subjects in his interviews feel super comfortable, feel super at ease, so that they are sharing his stories. He feels like his job is to get the story out into the world, and he wants to put as little between the documentary subject and the camera as possible. So he looks to make them super comfortable. Whereas before, as an editor and an early director, he was trying to almost too hard to, in his words, to sort of force a vision onto his team and to the subjects. And now he's become a little bit more relaxed over the years and realizes the way to bring a subject to life is just sort of let it paint itself. And so he's honed his own craft over the years, and his work is amazing.
And then the fourth artisans, anyone that knows me would not be surprised that I somehow figured out a way to get a rock band in the book. But Our Lady Peace is a very well-known Canadian rock band. We are both Canadian gentlemen of a certain age who grew up listening to Canadian indie rock, indie rock from everywhere, but Canadian indie rock in particular. Our Lady Peace was always one of the standout acts at that time. And we had the great benefit of speaking with two of the members of Our Lady Peace, two of the original members, Rain Maida, who is the lead singer, and Duncan Coots, who has been a longtime bass player. And there was a fascinating metaphor for business all through Our Lady Peace's story. They've been around for over 30 years at this point. Rain and Duncan think of themselves as the CEO and COO respectively of the band. Rain has got a very successful side gig as a tech entrepreneur, and he's brought a lot of what he's learned about business over time into the music business and the way that they've grown the band. But actually, it's been just all the disruptions to the music industry over time and the way that they as individuals and the band itself have had to shift and hone themselves to stay relevant over that course of that 30 years that we found to be a great way to learn some lessons from what would otherwise be a pretty strange couple of folks to profile in a business book.
Well, again, really appreciate that. It made for a very interesting read, and I get delighted whenever we can take ideas and lessons from one very different area into another. So love it, guys. Let's grab our first break. I'm your host, Dr. Elise Cortez. We're on air with Geoff Tuff and Stephen Goldbach of Deloitte, who each have long-spanning careers as principals in sustainability, innovation, and strategy. We've been talking a bit about their 3 books in total, how they weave together, the opportunity for us to learn from some of these artisans about how to hone. After the break, we're going to talk about our over-reliant focus on transformation in the world of business. We'll be right back.
Dr. Elise Cortez is a management consultant specializing in meaning and purpose, an inspirational speaker and author. She helps companies visioneer for greater purpose among stakeholders and develop purpose-inspired leadership and meaning-infused cultures that elevate fulfillment, performance, and commitment within the workforce. To learn more or to invite Elise to speak to your organization, please visit her at elisecortez.com. Let's talk about how to get your employees working on purpose. This is Working on Purpose with Dr. Elise Cortez. To reach our program today or to open a conversation with Elise, send an email to Elise, A-L-I-S-E, at elisecortez.com. Now, back to Working on Purpose.
Thanks for staying with us and welcome back to Working on Purpose. I'm your host, Dr. Elise Cortez. If you are just joining us, my guests are Geoff, Tuff, and Stephen Goldbach, the authors of Hone, How Purposeful Leaders Defy Drift. So one of the many delightful things that I get out of your books, all of your books actually, but this one in particular, was this notion of we have this tendency to over-rely on transformation in business. And I think if anybody's listening to this, they might find that a little bit surprising. I know I did. Now, I know for what you guys do on a day-to-day basis, it's not surprising, but lead us in, help us understand, why do we over-rely on transformation?
So, Steve, I think you got to go first. I'm loving the way that you've further crafted your metaphor around working out. So why don't you set up the whole notion of transformation using that?
Elise, have you ever made a New Year's resolution to work out more frequently?
Yes, I have.
Okay. So, I mean, that means you're a human being, because I figure that almost every human being has done that at least once in their lives. And, you see that all the time. I go to the gym pretty regularly, and January is just a you-know-what show. You can't get a machine. You can't get a squat rack. You can't get on a treadmill, because it's littered with everybody trying to get back in shape. But then it's pretty quick, into towards the end of January, where the gym starts to, become pretty empty again. And I think that transformation is basically the same. It's really hard to change a lot of behaviors at once. You can't go from being, sedentary to all of a sudden training like an Olympic athlete overnight. But that's sort of what transformation asks of organizations. And that's just really hard. And because it's really hard, it fails frequently, it's expensive. And it doesn't work out in the way that it's intended to. Now, Geoff and I are not anti-transformation. We just would say, like, transformation should be used when it's really needed. And that's when there's a major competitive disruption, something external. There's a really important new technology that you only have moments to implement. There's a really competitive disruption, a merger in your industry. Then perhaps that's a good reason. But what tends to happen is that we rely on transformation because we've been sedentary. We haven't been reacting over time. And our view on Hone is that we don't ever want that to be the reason for transformation. And so we're saying you've got to be honing, because there are going to be times where you might need to use transformation. And so we've got to be paying attention day over day, month over month, to what the world is evolving towards, so that we can be making minimally viable moves in order to address the change in surroundings.
And the only thing I'd add to that, Steve, is the big danger in the transformation myth being that it works and it's not expensive, what have you, is that it feeds upon itself. So if you believe that it's okay to not make too many changes because somewhere down the line we're going to be able to transform and take care of all the stuff that's accumulated over time and the bad behaviors and the drifting off course, which is obviously one of the central metaphors that we use in the book, then you are going to wait for that transformation. And you're going to, when you actually go try to execute the transformation, you're going to find out that it's too late, which just leads to even more Herculean efforts to try to get the metaphorical ship back on track. And so we probably come across in the book as being more overtly against transformation than we actually are, practically speaking, when we're working with our clients, because we understand sometimes it's necessary, but that sort of overstatement is, I think, necessary to combat the conventional wisdom right now out in the world that it's all about transformation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I don't think you can go a day without hearing the word transformation. And it's everywhere. So a couple of things really quick I want to situate for our listeners and viewers who haven't read the book yet that I have. You say that the book is a call for action for leaders to build the capability and mindset to hone their organizations, minimizing but not eliminating, as you say, the need for transformation. And so really, when you talk about honing, for listeners and viewers who are like, how do I stitch all this together, the artisans and everything else? I want to give a quick definition, and if you want to add to it as well, but what you say in the book about what honing really is, it's the idea of making conscious micro changes consistently over time to keep the organization on track. Is there more to it than that that we would define honing?
No, I think that sounds brilliant to us, Elise. If it came out of the book, it must be right on. But no,
I told you guys were brilliant already.
We're good at using many words to describe something much more simple than are needed. But that one I think is actually pretty succinct. But as I mentioned before, the central metaphor, one of the central metaphors we use in the book, is the whole notion of drift, and it comes from, I'd like to think, both of our love for being out on boats in the ocean. It may have been born more with me than it was with Steve, but I'm trying to help him learn the joy as well. And the metaphor is, if you've got a fixed point you're trying to head to, whether it's something you can see on the horizon or it's a location you're trying to get to that you've charted a course to, you inevitably, if you're on the water, you're going to drift off that course because of the wind or the waves or the current or tide or what have you. But in boating and sailing, you have the mechanisms to recognize when you're off course and make slight adjustments to counteract the forces that are hitting you. And so most of the time you are able to stay on course. In business, that's not the case. There are things coming at you every single day. You have to respond to a competitive threat. You have to do something about a new regulation. You need to take advantage of some sort of technology, and there is no fixed point on the horizon that you're heading towards. And so you can be dealing with all these day-to-day pressures and not actually realize that you've drifted off what your path towards what Steve and I call your elemental purpose, what you're trying to achieve. Mm-hmm. And so what those micro adjustments do that you talked about before is not only help you stay on track, but they force you to always be looking for the ways in which you might have drifted if you know that that's your central job, to make those micro adjustments.
Mm-hmm. So important. So since drift is part of your subtitle, I wanted to make sure that you hit that. So thank you. Now, another thing that I applaud about your book and really also align with is you have a strong focus on the idea of systems. And that's how I was educated, was in the world of thinking about things in systems. And then specifically, you're talking about management systems in the book, but you also situate that the CEO needs to be the chief system designer. Can you say a bit more about that?
Well, why don't I start with what is a management system?
Okay.
And then because I don't think that's an obvious. It's not a word that has a shared definition. And then Geoff can talk about why the CEO needs to play the role of chief system designer. So a management system is the collection of formal and informal processes, decision rights, infrastructure in an organization that motivates human behavior. So think about things like formal performance evaluation, or formal organization design, or budgets, or those are examples of formal elements that motivate how people behave. So for example, you've got a performance evaluation, a set of key performance indicators. Those are the things that your organization is telling you, this is what success looks like. But there's also informal management systems, and informal management systems are things like the questions that a key leader asks in meetings. Oftentimes that leads to a response. There's a famous story about J. Edgar Hoover, who got a memo and then wrote in the margins of the memo, "Watch the borders." And his underlings took that to mean we should be deploying, troops to the borders to check the borders. And really what he meant was like your margins in the memo are too large. And so people, the little questions that people ask are management systems in and by themselves, or just what people perceive gets people promoted. So those are management systems, and collectively they shape and motivate all the behavior that takes place in an organization. Now, if you want to be honing, those are your tools for how to, change ever so slightly what your people are doing so that your organization can do slightly different things over time. But those are the tools that you use. It's not inspirational posters on a wall talking about culture. It's actual changing what people succeed. And the reason we say, and I'll set Geoff up here, the CEO needs to do it is because they're the only one that can see the whole system. But Geoff, why don't you expand on that?
Well, yeah, and I feel like it may be helpful to just anchor this in one of the core beliefs, and Steve and I have about strategy, one of the core methodologies that actually seems to pop up in all of our books, something called the strategy choice cascade. This is actually something that was developed by Roger Martin and a number of our colleagues at Monitor Group a number of years ago. It was popularized in Roger's book with A.G. Lafley called Playing to Win. And I won't take you into all the detail of it, but it stipulates that, amongst other things, good strategy doesn't happen unless you've made choices. And there are 5 broad clusters of choices that are all interlinked that make up a sound strategy. You need to make choices around your goals and aspirations, around where you're going to play in the market, around how you're going to win in those markets via your business models, around the capabilities you need to run those business models, and then the management systems you need to have in place to support those capabilities. And there's all sorts of, as I said before, interrelationship and laddering up and laddering down and what have you. And one of the observations that actually led to Hone, and I will say this is an obsession of Steve's, and he would call the management systems cluster of those choices to be the pinky toe of the choice cascade. It's the thing that is always assumed to actually not matter that much, but that actually provides balance to the entire system. And so our observation is that most senior executives, most CEOs conceive of their job as being in those first few buckets. It's their job to lay out the goals and aspirations. It's their job to set out the bold vision around where to play and how to win. And then it's everyone else's job to execute. But the challenge to that is, if you believe, like we do, that management systems ultimately are the things that will determine whether you either succeed or fail at executing your strategy, those should be the things that get the vast majority of the attention of the people who actually control what happens in companies. So we're trying to flip this orthodoxy on its head a little bit, that CEOs are about setting the vision, but not necessarily executing it. And we're saying, actually, yeah, you can set the vision, but you absolutely have to be involved in the execution, because if you're not, then it's not going to happen. And that does not mean, by the way, that the CEOs need to personally take responsibility for working on every single management system, but they do need to understand the breadth of them that are at the company's disposal, the ones that matter most because they are so related to the behaviors that will drive towards the objectives that the company has. And then they need to be able to empower those that control those management systems to work on them relentlessly to execute in the way that they need to achieve the strategy. And that's as I said, it sounds like, yeah, that sounds pretty logical, but it's not the way that many companies run. It's not the way that many senior executives think.
Right. And this show is very much educational and inspirational. That people listen to the show to become better leaders, to become better at running their companies. So that's tremendous contribution right there. And I don't know that I would have distinguished that even from having read your book. So I'll take it. Let's grab our last break. I'm your host, Dr. Elise Cortez. We've been on air with Geoff Tuff and Stephen Goldbach from Deloitte, who each have long-spanning careers as principals in sustainability, innovation, and strategy. We've been talking a bit about the importance of not hyper-focusing on transformation, but the opportunity for honing. After the break, we're going to talk about overcoming the systemic imbalance in the shareholder focus to start. We'll be right back.
Dr. Elise Cortez is a management consultant specializing in meaning and purpose, an inspirational speaker and author. She helps companies visioneer for greater purpose among stakeholders and develop purpose-inspired leadership and meaning-infused cultures that elevate fulfillment, performance, and commitment within the workforce. To learn more or to invite Elise to speak to your organization, please visit her at elisecortez.com. Let's talk about how to get your employees working on purpose. This is Working on Purpose with Dr. Elise Cortez. To reach our program today or to open a conversation with Elise, send an email to Elise, A-L-I-S-E, at elisecortez.com. Now, back to Working on Purpose.
Thanks for staying with us and welcome back to Working on Purpose. I'm your host, Dr. Elise Cortez. If you're just joining us, my guests are Geoff Tuff and Stephen Goldbach, the authors of Hone, How Purposeful Leaders Defy Drift. So as somebody who has spent a good portion of time as a conscious capitalist and certainly studying stakeholder capitalism or other things like that, I understand the need not to focus on just solely the shareholders in terms of an organizational operation. But when you add in the element with what the two of you about just really thinking about that, when you do that, that creates a systemic imbalance for the organization. That is very, very interesting. Can you share a bit more about that perspective?
Well, I'd love to take this one and see if Geoff wants to add. So I think part of it is, let's recognize where most shareholder value comes from in a commercial for-profit organization. So most of the value comes from being around a long time. The so-called terminal value of a free cash flow valuation, right? It comes from that assumption that the company is going to be generating profits for a long time. If you do any kind of a valuation exercise at the end of a 5 or 7 year or 10-year forecast, you make this assumption that we're going to freeze the business in laminate for at that moment, and then we apply a multiple to that. That's a really important assumption. And it's and when you think about it, the only way that companies can survive forever is by also being relevant to other stakeholders. You won't have an organization that is relevant if you're not serving customers well, if you're not taking care of them, if you're cutting costs out of your product that could be better put in to continue to create customer loyalty. You will not be able to serve your customers well if you don't attract great employees. You will not be able to serve your customers well if you're not investing in technology, if you're not engaging with your local communities and being relevant. That is just what is good for broader stakeholders, usually makes a company more resilient and leads to more shareholder value over the long run. Usually the notion of being shareholder focused tends to come with things where we're maximizing profit in the short run, which usually comes with trading off long-term competitive position. It's not always the case, but it is the case that you can maximize shareholder value by simply making sure that you're a durable entity over time.
Yeah, and I think, again, we try to be somewhat consistent through our books, and this principle in some way ties back to some of what we talked about in Provoked, that the only way to manage in a world in which uncertainty is increasing, and we both fundamentally believe it is, whether that's due to technological reasons or other reasons, is by widening the aperture in terms of what you pay attention to. And by definition, if you only pay attention to a subset of your stakeholders, i.e. your shareholders, when you're trying to think about how to drive performance, then you are by definition narrowing the aperture. But there's nothing in what we're suggesting that in keeping consideration of all stakeholders in the decisions you make day in, day out, there's nothing in that is fundamentally value destroying or intended to be value destroying. In fact, we believe that in the face of all this uncertainty, taking the long view, taking the wide aperture is going to lead to both long-term value, but more short-term value as well, especially as cycles accelerate.
Mm-hmm. Beautifully said. Thank you. One of the other things that I found delightful about your book that I did not know at all was the history of how the Big Four came to be. I didn't know that. I have so many friends and people connected to the Big Four, but I didn't realize how they were born. Can you share that history?
Well,
Steve, you should do this one. You're more of a history. You're more of a history buff on this than I am. Yeah.
Well, the Big Four generally have been the product of lots of mergers and acquisitions over the years. Deloitte was born nearly 180 years ago, just there was a challenge in the railroad industry, and William Walsh Deloitte was our founder. And then, I think you might be referring to the idea that many of our businesses have been local accounting firms that have been built up over the years. Elise, is that what you're
yes? Where I was riveting on, it was just the notion of after the Sarbanes-Oxley Act of 2002, when you had to separate your accounting audits from your consulting.
Well, that actually, so the Big Four had existed before then, and they were the Big Eight, the Big Seven in different ways.
Right.
What ended up happening around the Sarbanes-Oxley was, in later, and I won't get into the specifics, is basically it said there needs to be a separation between the business of providing attestation services or audit services and the business of also providing consulting services to those companies. Many of the companies that were in the auditing business around that time all decided to jettison their consulting practices for the most part. Deloitte did not. Deloitte chose not to do that. And instead, we followed the regulation and we said there are certain things that we can't do for our audit clients, and we will serve them as our audit clients. And then there are other clients that we will serve in a consulting capacity. Interestingly, the industry has come back and sort of rebuilt itself around a model that is more consistent with the model that we've chosen. And the thing that we feel like it's advantaged us over the years is that we are able to, having a broad breadth of services, bring lots of different capabilities to a set of clients that have complex and novel needs. And those needs don't neatly fit into boxes that are on our org charts. It's about the deployment of multiple of those capabilities, in particular to the world that Geoff and I now sit in, which is sustainability and infrastructure, where it's hard to imagine how you might do a project like Geoff does in the world of energy without having, risk experts, without having financial advisory experts, without having regulatory expertise, without having tax expertise. And so we've been blessed by not having, in some respects, made the choice that others made back at the turn of the 2000s.
So for any listeners and viewers who also are kind of riveted on this, I want to just situate what the names that I learned to associate here from your book. So I'm going to say them and you tell me if I have these right. But so Deloitte remained, it stayed, it followed the regulation and kept itself as a consulting arm, as well as the auditing services. But EY, you say, became Capgemini. And KPMG spun out its consulting business into an IPO, which eventually went by the name of Bearing Point, which, of course, we all know these names. And PwC sold its consulting business to IBM, creating IBM Business Consulting Services. Do I have this right?
Yep.
Okay. So I think that's interesting because we all know these names, but I didn't understand their forefathers, if you will.
Yeah, that was the consequence of the Sarbanes-Oxley. Some of it was part of that at that time in and around the 2000s, as folks started to deal with the consequences of the changed regulation.
But now, of course, everything's getting mixed back together again, and different brands or parts of different companies. And I don't blame you, Elise, for not being able to keep track. But it certainly is a dynamic space.
Well, it's just really helpful to understand, since I'm in the consulting world too. I'm not in that space at all, what you guys are doing, but this is important history to know, I think. So, okay. So you already been talking a bit about the idea of the minimally viable thoughts toward honing. And so the minimal viable thought toward honing for the future. I don't know if you want to say more about that. I think in the bit of time that we have together here, I would love for each of you maybe just to share a couple of key takeaways that you've learned from your years of working with these large companies to help them navigate complex problems. If there's any patterns or key insights that you've been noticing beyond what we've already talked about today, would definitely love to hear from both of you on that before we have to close.
Sure. Why don't we trade off a little bit here, Steve? I'll do one, you do one, and then we'll go till we run out of steam, which may actually take several more shows. But so the one insight, and we got it early in exploring Detonate, and it's carried through to Hone as well, is that you have to strike balance. And I think there's an overinterpretation sometimes of what Steve and I write about, to assume that when we talk about, for example, blowing up the playbooks, that it means blowing up the entire company, or when we talk about provoking the future in which you have advantage, it means turning away from the path that you're on right now. And that has not been our intent from the beginning. It's really what we're trying to have people do is redeploy their capital in a way where they take more ambitious bets in shifting the way things have been done in the past. And what we're finding, I think, especially as technology in particular, and even more particularly AI these days, as it accelerates the pace of change and creates a ever more uncertain world. Again, another theme I'd come back to is that the shift in the balance is changing, and we're finding that. And actually, one of the things we often say when we talk about the books is that, it used to be, even at the beginning of writing Detonate, it used to be that the status quo felt quite safe and change felt quite risky. And now actually we're finding that in many circumstances it's flipped, where the safe thing to do is actually go try to change something, and the risky thing is to remain with the status quo. But it always is a matter of balance, and whether you get that balance right will depend a lot on the nature of the space in which you play, what you're trying to achieve, et cetera. But that is definitely one key theme that I've taken away, and I hope our readers have taken away as well.
Awesome.
Yeah, and I'll build on that and share my own, and we'll probably this will probably take us to the end, I'm guessing. It's 1A and 1B. So 1A is human beings have this capacity to fundamentally believe that the future is going to be continued from the past. And in particular, an assumption that is terrible in business is that, you even see it happening now with AI. We're saying, will we get the return from our investments in AI? And it kind of fails the smell test, because if we don't invest in AI, the likelihood that your business is going to be competitive in the future is almost a probability of 0.
Yeah.
Right? If you choose not to invest in AI. And so when people say, I can't generate a return on AI, it's like you have to compare it to the alternative, right? And not what you've got today. That is done, right? You either have a choice now, I can invest or not invest, and the not invest path doesn't look very good. And so if you're investing to avoid a downside, that's as good of a return as investing to create an upside from today. But people have this innate capacity to just presume that we're safe in whatever we have today, which is so not the case. And that's why I think the thing that I've learned the most is the importance of always going back to first principles. And whenever you're doing something like making an incremental management decision, it's not about just extending the past. It's about what's the investment choice of, like, do I do it or do I not do it? And you have to then think about what the consequences of not doing it are. We're just not very good at that more generally than we are.
Very helpful, gentlemen. Yes, you're right. We have come to the close here. However, we do enough time for each of you to say maybe 15 seconds each. What would you like to leave our listeners and viewers with around the world?
Move before you think you have to, or said differently, don't overthink it.
Yeah. Go check out our book, honethebook.com. We'd love to hear what you think. Catch us both on LinkedIn. The nicest thing that an author can have is engagement with their ideas. So we love to engage, and hit us up.
Delightful. I'm so happy to know both of you. You're both inspiring. You both teach me a lot, and you're delightful to engage with. Thanks for coming back on Working on Purpose.
Thanks for having us. It was fun. Again.
Absolutely. Listeners and viewers, you're going to learn more about these guys and their books. The best way to start is to find them both on LinkedIn, and then also check out their book at honethebook.com. So HONE, thebook.com. Last week, if you missed the live show, you can always catch it via recorded podcast. See you next week for another nourishing and elevating conversation. Together, let's lean in and learn how to make workplaces that work for everyone and find ways to do business that betters the world. Let's work on purpose.
We hope you've enjoyed this week's program. Be sure to tune into Working on Purpose, featuring your host, Dr. Elise Cortez, each week on W4CY. Together, we'll create a world where business operates conscientiously, leadership inspires impassioned performance, and employees are fulfilled in work that provides the meaning and purpose they crave. See you there. Let's work on purpose.